During the early 1600s, the initial African slaves were transported to the coastal areas of North America, starting a grim period in history for this ethnicity. From the late 15th century, the transatlantic slave trade saw about 12.5 million Africans forcibly transported across the Atlantic between 1525 and 1866, with approximately 10.7 million surviving the brutal journey. These forcibly abducted black people became the backbone of the American economy for generations. In 1619, the first recorded group of roughly 20 African slaves arrived in Virginia aboard a Dutch ship. Although the occurrence was minimal, it established the groundwork for the enslavement of African people in the American territories on a larger scale. The rise of slavery in America was significantly attributed to the economic aspirations of the European colonizers as they expanded into the New World. They soon discovered the lucrative opportunities in agriculture, yet the cultivation of crops such as tobacco, cotton, and sugar cane demanded extensive labor efforts. Initially, indentured servants from Europe were used to meet this demand, but as labor needs grew, plantation owners turned to Africa. In 1705, the Virginia legislature passed a law declaring all slaves would be enslaved for life, thereby legalizing slavery. This legislation was in response to the growing demand for cheap labor, and also reflected an intent to exert stricter control over the African population. The first slave farm in North America was established in Jamestown, Virginia, in 1619. Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin in 1793 revolutionized the cotton industry, making it more profitable, leading to the rapid expansion of slave farms in the southern states. In South Carolina, for instance, the slave population increased from about 7,000 in 1700 to over 100,000 by 1790. This swift proliferation was propelled by the substantial market for cotton, especially from industries in the northern United States and Britain. By the year 1860, the southern part of the U.S. was responsible for 3/4 of the global cotton supply, primarily grown on slave labor plantations. As the first rays of sunlight quietly climb the horizon, the slaves in the American South are already laboring in the fields. From the tobacco plantations of Virginia to the cotton fields of Mississippi, the daily lives of the enslaved are marked by grueling work, unimaginable suffering, and the constant threat of violence. According to Henry Bibb, I am a slave, a prisoner for life. I own nothing and can gain nothing except what belongs to my master. The living conditions of slaves were extremely harsh, often cramped in small, dilapidated cabins. Some cabins were only 10 feet by 12 feet, yet housed up to 10 people with no privacy. The furniture was usually just rough wooden beds and a few cooking utensils. Children who couldn't work in the fields had no shoes, socks, jackets, or pants. They only received 2 coarse linen shirts a year. Similar conditions existed on plantations throughout the South, such as the Evergreen Plantation in Louisiana, which in its mid-19th century heyday had slave quarters consisting of 4 rows of 22 cabins each, housing over 150 slaves. As abolitionist and former slave sojourner Truth famously said, "I have borne 13 children and seen almost all sold off to slavery. When I wept with a mother's grief, only Jesus heard me." On plantations, food was often scarce. Each slave's weekly ration was a bushel of cornmeal and 4 pounds of pork, or if no pork was available, a bushel of sweet potatoes, along with a small amount of salt. Enslaved people subsisted mainly on cornmeal, lard, and molasses. On some plantations, they were forced to cultivate small gardens for extra vegetables to supplement their meager rations. This inadequate diet led to widespread malnutrition and diseases such as pellagra, a vitamin deficiency causing diarrhea, dermatitis, and dementia. Workdays were long and arduous, typically from sunrise to sunset. In cotton plantations, slaves were required to pick at least 200 pounds of cotton daily. This task left their fingers bleeding and bodies exhausted, and failure to meet quotas often led to severe punishment, including whipping, beatings, or even mutilation. The lower he called, the harder he hit, and the faster the blood flowed from the spot, the longer he beat. This brutality wasn't limited to adults. Children as young as 3 or 4 were also assigned to work on plantations. They were often tasked with carrying water and food while serving as small servants to white children. In 1852, the escaped slave and abolitionist Moses Roper wrote about his experiences. I often saw the overseer beating my mother. Even during childbirth, she was forced to work almost immediately after delivery. Healthcare for the enslaved was nearly non-existent, and plantation owners often considered slaves expendable commodities. Diseases like dysentery and pneumonia ravaged the slave quarters, claiming countless lives. In some cases, enslaved women were subjected to medical experiments, such as the notorious surgeries performed by Marion Sims on enslaved women in the 1840s without anesthesia. This lack of basic medical care led to high mortality rates among the enslaved population. By 1850, the average lifespan of a slave was only 21.4 years, and in some plantations, infant mortality rates were as high as 50%, as observed by the former slave and abolitionist Raymond in an 1859 speech. The hearts of slave mothers bled when he thought of his children, not knowing when they might be taken from his arms and sold, and that he might never see them again. Families were torn apart, children were snatched from their mother's embrace and taken to distant plantations. The abuse of enslaved women by white slave owners was rampant. The tragic story of Celia, an enslaved woman in Missouri, illustrates this. She was repeatedly assaulted by her master and was later executed after killing him in self-defense.